I've co-authored another book. It's called A Certain Ambiguity, and it's for the lack of a better descriptor, it's a mathematical novel in the sense that mathematics is the central character in the novel. Yeah, it is peopled with a lot of people, interactions, ideas, yet, but mathematics in some senses forms a central strand of the narrative. And it is about how as humans we do search for certainty, and in some ways we tend to believe that mathematics is probably the best guarantor of certainty we know. And then an attempt to examine the question of how far that assumption is true, where does certainty lead us in mathematics, how far can we go with that idea of certainty, where does it stop? And it is contrasted and compared in some ways through the narrative with the idea of faith and our own search of certainty through religion and faith. And does it differ in some ways? Is it similar? At the heart of it, does it come from similar motivations that take us to mathematics, which to me is a very creative pursuit. I mean, this idea that there is something predictable or rational about doing science. No, that is a description of the process, but the attempt to do mathematics is an entirely creative act, as much as, and perhaps more so than any act of writing, poetry or prose can ever be. Well, simply because if at the heart of it is the question of the search for certainty, and it is the story of a grandson who learns this, who through documents, letters, tends to learn the story of his grandfather, a mathematician who had traveled to the US in the early 20th century, and then had come back to India, but there was this missing portion of his life which is not well documented. And he learns how his grandfather was arrested for blasphemy, a possible trial was undertaken. And through the grandfather's story, you sort of play out the interplay of faith and rationality, and to what extent faith can stand the scrutiny of rationality in the story of the grandfather. And as the grandson is unveiling the story, he, as an undergraduate in mathematics, is learning some things about geography and infinity from a teacher who tends to understand the beauty of these subjects, and he begins to see a parallel in the kind of questions his grandfather is struggling to answer in his own trial with what is unfolding in the mathematics that he is learning. See, I think it reaches into areas where you can begin to see a semblance of the questions that lead to Gödel. You know, Gödel is a very, very complicated piece of mathematics which is far too easily written out in simple prose erroneously, and that is done far too often, and far too many people believe they understand the implications of Gödel while getting it wrong. So the book takes examples which actually lead to the kind of questions Gödel asks, but it looks at it, the two most important questions it looks at is geometry and the question of the fifth postulate, the kind of different geometries that are possible depending on which axiom we pick. It looks at the idea of infinities, the kind of different infinities, that you can actually compare infinities, that one infinity can be greater than the other, what you can say in such cases. And these examples, which are far more easily, in some senses, certainly geometry comprehended, yet how they take us to decision points which tend to question our idea of certainty about the universe or how the world is structured, become a takeoff point to answer some of the questions which are on the path to Gödel, but we do not reach Gödel's uncertainty. Well, I mean, I think the beginning of sparks of these ideas are very different from their actual realization. I'm a co-author of the book. The first author is my friend and Gaurav Suri. We were in school together. Through very different courses, we both ended up doing a PhD in mathematics in the US at the same time. I was on the East Coast at NYU, the Courant Institute. He was at Stanford. And coincidentally, we both reached the same stage. We cleared our writtens, our orals. We were working on our thesis when we both decided at different times to quit and not go ahead with it. So maybe almost 10 years after that process, we sat down and started talking about what made us go away from mathematics, to look at the question of what first brought us into mathematics, what was interesting about mathematics, and what finally led us not to pursue that course. We never answered the last part. I think caught up in the idea of what led us to mathematics, what we enjoyed about mathematics, discussing that led to this book. Well, see, I think you will find a number of examples like that, and I think it is important to tell those stories because they are gripping stories. But what we forget in this tendency to look at these examples, that a lot of mathematicians are in many other ways very normal human beings with this phenomenal ability in one area, and that is something we have to keep in mind. We love to mythify and exaggerate. If I take you back to the character of Ramanujan, we Indians have invested so much in Ramanujan that we tend to buy the worst kind of sort of Oriental discourse centered around Ramanujan, that Ramanujan was this almost mystic mathematician who in fact would probably be a worse mathematician if he had been trained better. And that is just so much nonsense. It isn't borne out by anything that we know of Ramanujan. Nobody makes the argument that a genius like Euler, a very, very creative mathematician, is representative of the Swiss character. I mean, the Swiss are supposedly these dour people, and there is Euler, this magnificently creative man, and nobody seems to find a contradiction or a similarity or tend to read anything about one from the other. And nobody ever makes the claim that Euler, actually, if he was trained less, would be a better mathematician. You don't hear this kind of nonsense when any mathematician from the West is described. But with Ramanujan, you get to hear all this kind of nonsense all the time, and it may be that there are writers from outside who write it, but we ourselves relish it. We tend to, in Bangalore, it is necessary to say this, we tend to believe this great myth about ourselves that we have this special dispensation for mathematics. Actually, no, I mean, I think on the average, most Indians are as bad as or good at mathematics as any other people. I've taught mathematics, I've interacted with people, and there's no truth to that, absolutely. But I think maybe our insecurity as a people tends to feed off myths and makes us more, I personally feel, look even more ludicrous when we are willing to accept such things. Well, look, I mean, 2, 3 things. To me, learning mathematics is learning a new language, but it's a language which is a little different. It is a language through which we communicate scientific ideas. Now, I think like any other language, you need to learn the alphabets, you need to learn the grammatical rules, and nobody I know of complains that that the ABC has to be memorized and that some rules of grammar have to be memorized. And I don't see why people tend to complain that a little bit of mathematics requires some kind of rote learning. That is part of the process. Once you have the necessary prerequisite for the language, and you have the necessary structures for language, this is where we must take children away from the idea of mathematics as some tool that gets you jobs or lets you get marks. Because once you learn a language, this is where you start having fun with the language. You learn to read with that language, you learn to create with that language, and that is what we need to teach, that once you have these tools of mathematics, what does it mean to create with this language? What does it mean to read with this language? What is the kind of pleasure you can have from reading text written out in mathematics? And this is what we do not take into our curriculum.